Hi, I am Jonas, and I'm a web development teacher at udemy.com. In my beginner HTML5 and CSS3 course, which includes premium support, I get a ton of questions from my students. So I decided to create this video where I reply to the top 5 questions that I get all the time from students. So the first one, and this is an absolute classic, is, "Hey Jonas, what's the difference between classes and IDs?" And it's a very simple question, but for beginners, it's crucial that they understand the difference. So basically, we use IDs and classes to give HTML element names, so we can then select them in CSS in order to style them. So to use an ID, we use the ID attribute in HTML and the hash symbol to select the element by ID in our CSS code, just like you can see in this example here. Now, to use a class, we use the class attribute in HTML and select the element in CSS using the dot selector. But now, what's actually the difference between them? Well, each ID can only exist once in the HTML document, meaning that IDs are unique. Technically, you could actually give two elements the same ID, but that would be invalid HTML, okay? So that wouldn't really be perfect. So again, you can use each ID name only once on your HTML page. Now that has some serious implications for reusability. Like, imagine you start using an ID for elements you think you're only gonna need once on your page, but then later you actually want to reuse the element. And then you would have to go back and change everything from ID to class, and that would be terrible, right? So in modern HTML and CSS development, we actually only ever use classes, because that makes our code more reusable and more portable. So, next question. Now, although I explain this topic in my courses, I still get this important question all the time. What's the difference between block level, inline block, and inline elements? So let's clear up this question once and for all, okay? So let's start with the block level box or element, and we can actually say both. Now, first off, the type of a box is always defined by the display property. So in the case of the block level element, the display property is usually set to block. But please note that the values flex for flexbox layouts, list item, and table also produce block level boxes. Now, all HTML elements have a default display property, and elements such as paragraphs or divs, which are usually formatted visually as blocks, have their display property set to block by default. We can always, of course, change this property manually, which can be very useful in some cases. Okay, so being a block level box, this box will always occupy as much space as possible, which is usually 100% of its parent width, and therefore create line breaks after and before it, meaning that blocks are formatted vertically one after the other. Now about inline boxes, they are basically the opposite of block level boxes, because their content is distributed in lines, meaning that an inline box only occupies the space that its content actually needs. Therefore, they also don't cause line breaks after or before them, but instead, they just sit inside their block level parent element. Now about the box model, things work a bit different with inline boxes. First, the height and width property do not apply here, which means that we cannot use these properties. And second, we can only specify horizontal paddings and margins on inline elements, so only on the left and on the right side. That's the way the box model works on inline elements. So of course, this has some serious limitations, and in order to overcome them, there's another type of box, and that's the inline block box. Now, inline block boxes are technically also inline boxes, but which simply work as a block level box on the inside. So since they are technically inline elements, they also only use up their content space and cause no line breaks. But since they work as a block level box on the inside, the box model applies to them just like in the regular block level boxes. And this can be extremely handy sometimes. Now all we need to do in order to set an element to an inline block is to set its display property to inline block. And that's it. So all of that may sound a bit confusing, but if you try it out in code, like you can do in one of my courses, then it will all make sense. Alright, number 3. Why do we have to clear floats, and how do we do it? And what's the clearfix class for? So first things first, when we have a certain element in which all the child elements are floated, then we say that the height of the parent element collapses, leaving it with a height of 0 pixels. As you can see, this is exactly what happens in the example here, where the gray parent element is much smaller than its children, which is usually not the case, of course. So this is because of us not clearing the floats. And of course, this comes with a lot of problems. And therefore, in a situation like this, we have to clear the floats in order to make it look more like this. And this is how it should be, right? Now, we clear these floats usually with something called a clearfix. A clearfix can be a class in CSS that we then add to all parent elements that have all their child elements floated. So in our example here, the section on the right side has the clearfix on it, and therefore it will have its float cleared. Now this clearfix class might look a bit scary, and it's not 100% required to understand it in order to use it. But anyway, what happens basically is that the clearfix class places a pseudo element after the element that it's used on, and that pseudo element has the clear property on it, clearing both the left and the right floats. Okay, so you can just use this clearfix class on all your elements which have all of their children floated. The next question is this one. Hey Jonas, what's the difference between the body selector and the universal selector? And that's actually a great question. So maybe you have seen some code like this, where some global properties are specified in a universal selector and some other global properties are specified in a body selector. So I called all of these properties global properties because these are basically styles that we want to apply everywhere on the page. But why then did we specify them in different selectors? And what's the difference between them? Well, first off, with the universal selector, we simply select every single element on the page and make the styles apply to them. In this case, margin, padding, and box sizing. And so then, all the elements will have these declarations. Now, some people still say that the universal selector is not efficient, but don't worry about that, because that's no longer relevant in modern web development. Alright, and now about the body selector. And here things work a bit different. So we put styles on the body selector because it is the parent element of all the other elements on our page, right? And by putting these styles here, some of them will get inherited to the child elements through a CSS mechanism called inheritance. Now, not all of the CSS properties are actually inherited, and the ones that are usually related to font and text. And that's why we see properties such as line height, font weight, font family, and color on the body selector. Other properties like margins and paddings are not inherited to child elements, and so we have to put these in a universal selector so that we can still have them applied to all of our elements. Alright, so again, inheritance allows some specific properties to basically be passed from parent to children, and by putting these styles in the body element, we make use of inheritance instead of just putting all of them in the universal selector. Does that make sense? Now, if you actually want to learn exactly how inheritance works behind the scenes, you can just check out my advanced CSS course on udemy.com. Alright, and now the last question that I get asked all the time. How do I center a block element both vertically and horizontally inside another element? And this one is actually pretty simple. All you need is this simple trick. We set the top and left properties to 50%, and then we translate the element back minus 50% in both directions. Does that sound confusing? Then let me explain why this works using this example here only in the vertical direction, but it works the exact same way in both directions. So first we move the element down 50% by setting the top property to 50%. And these 50% are actually 50% of the parent element's height. And this is very important. So that is the first step. Then, by using transform set to translate minus 50%, we move the element back up again by exactly 50% of its own height. So this time it's not the parent's height, but the own element's height. Okay? And with that, the element will stay exactly in the vertical center. And again, it works the exact same way for horizontal centering. So this is a very nice trick to center block elements inside of each other. And it's not too complex, so you can easily use it whenever you need it. Now, of course, there are other more modern ways of doing this, like with Flexbox or CSS Grid, but it's always good to know the fundamentals of CSS and that you can easily do it without the cutting-edge technologies. Alright, and that's it for my top 5 questions. I hope you learned something new about HTML and CSS in this video. But of course, there's so much more to learn. And that's why I published a beginner HTML and CSS course over at udemy.com, where we built a real-world project from scratch. It comes with over 11 hours of content and premium support. You can check it out and sign up today using my exclusive YouTube coupon. Just click the link in the description below, and I see you in class.